May 5, 1945, 07:20 hours. Wageningen, Western Netherlands. Staff Sergeant William Cooper of the 101st Airborne Division stood at the edge of the small Dutch town, watching civilians emerge from their homes as American forces rolled through the streets. He'd seen liberated populations before, France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and expected the usual celebrations, flags waving, people cheering, perhaps some wine and kisses from grateful locals. What he saw instead stopped him cold. The people moving slowly toward the American convoy weren't celebrating. They were shuffling, elderly moving like they were ancient, adults supporting each other, and children who looked more like ghosts than human beings. A little girl, maybe 7 years old, stood by the roadside in a dress that had been altered multiple times to fit her shrinking frame. Her face was skeletal, her eyes enormous in hollowed sockets, her legs like sticks in wooden clogs that were probably the only shoes she owned. When Cooper's jeep stopped, the girl took a tentative step forward, staring at the Americans with an expression that mixed desperate hope with the caution of someone who'd learned not to expect kindness. She didn't wave or smile. She just stood there, swaying slightly, too weak for anything more energetic than standing. Cooper reached into his pack and pulled out a D-ration chocolate bar. He knelt down and extended it toward the girl, who stared at it without moving. For a moment, he thought she didn't recognize what it was. Then her hand shot out, grabbed the chocolate, and clutched it to her chest like it was the most precious thing in the world. Tears began streaming down her hollow cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered in English, her voice barely audible. "Thank you. Thank you. Thank you." Behind her, more children were appearing, 20, 30, 40 of them, all skeletal, all staring at the Americans with that same mixture of hope and disbelief. Some were being carried by parents too weak to support much weight. Others held each other up, leaning on siblings or friends to remain standing. Cooper looked at his men, saw the shock on their faces as they registered what months of starvation had done to an entire population of children. Private First Class Michael Torres, a medic from Texas who'd seen combat casualties that would haunt him for life, whispered, "My God. Sarge, they're dying right in front of us." "Break out all the rations," Cooper ordered quietly. "Everything we've got. These kids are starving to death." What followed was chaos of the best kind. American soldiers distributing every scrap of food they carried. Children crying as they held chocolate and crackers and canned meat. Dutch parents collapsing to their knees in gratitude. And hardened combat veterans discovering that feeding starving children felt more meaningful than any battle they'd won. Cooper would later write in his diary, "We rolled into Wageningen expecting to be heroes. Instead, we became witnesses to what happens when evil targets civilians systematically. Those kids, I can't get them out of my head. The little girl with the chocolate bar keeps appearing in my dreams. She weighed maybe 35 pounds. 7 years old, and she weighed what my niece weighed at age 3. This is what we were fighting against. This is why the war mattered." For the Dutch civilians of Western Netherlands who'd survived the hunger winter of 1944 to 45, American liberation meant more than military victory or political freedom. It meant food for children who'd been dying of starvation. It meant the end of watching your own sons and daughters waste away while you were powerless to save them. It meant the moment when hope, which had died slowly over months of systematic deprivation, suddenly, miraculously, returned. The hunger winter that devastated Western Netherlands from September 1944 through May 1945 was neither natural disaster nor unfortunate consequence of warfare. It was deliberate German policy designed to punish Dutch civilians for supporting Allied operations and to maximize suffering during occupation's final months. The numbers documented systematic atrocity. Dutch civilians in Western Netherlands affected, approximately 4.5 million. Deaths directly attributable to starvation, 18,000 to 22,000 documented. Though actual numbers may be higher, children who died, estimated $2,500 to $3,000. Children showing severe malnutrition symptoms at liberation, approximately $200,000. Daily caloric intake by February 1945, 400 to 800 calories per person, compared to normal requirement of 2,000 to 2,500 calories. Food distribution ceased entirely. Multiple weeks in early 1945, fuel available for heating. Essentially none by January 1945, forcing families to burn furniture, books, and anything combustible. The crisis began in September 1944 when the Dutch government in exile, working with Allied command, called for a railway strike to support Allied operations following the failed Operation Market Garden offensive. The strike was designed to disrupt German military logistics and help Allied forces break through German defenses. German authorities retaliated with calculated brutality. On September 17, 1944, German Reich Commissioner Arthur Seyss-Inquart ordered a complete food embargo on Western Netherlands, cutting off all supplies to the most densely populated region of the country. The policy was explicitly punitive. Dutch civilians would be starved for supporting Allied operations. The timing was catastrophic. The embargo began just as winter approached, when stored food from harvest would normally sustain populations through cold months. With the railway system paralyzed by the strike and German forces blocking road transport, Western Netherlands became an isolated food desert where existing stocks were consumed within weeks and no resupply was possible. German occupation authorities demonstrated systematic indifference to Dutch civilian suffering. Requests for food relief were ignored or denied. Appeals to international humanitarian organizations were blocked. Proposals to allow food transport through German-controlled territories were rejected. The deliberate policy was clearly articulated in German military communications captured after the war. Dutch support for Allied operations would be punished through deprivation that would create an object lesson about the costs of resistance. The starvation wasn't accidental. It was policy. The Dutch government in exile, operating from London, issued desperate appeals for help. Queen Wilhelmina broadcast radio messages describing the crisis and pleading for Allied intervention. But Allied forces, focused on the final push into Germany, couldn't immediately divert resources to liberate Western Netherlands. The strategic calculation was brutal. Delaying liberation to maintain momentum toward Germany's defeat meant accepting Dutch civilian deaths in the interim. The progression of starvation followed predictable patterns that Dutch civilians documented in diaries, letters, and testimonies that survived the war. The decline from adequacy to crisis to catastrophe happened gradually, then suddenly, as each threshold of desperation was crossed. September to October 1944. Rationing tightened but remained minimally adequate. Families consumed stored food from summer harvests, potatoes, grain, preserved vegetables. They hoped the embargo would end quickly, that Allied forces would break through German lines, that the crisis would be temporary. Families maintained relative normalcy despite shortages. Schools remained open. Workplaces functioned. Life continued with adjustments, but not yet desperation. November, December 1944. Rations dropped below subsistence levels as stored food ran out. The official ration fell to 1,000 calories per day, then 800, then lower. But even official rations became unreliable. Distribution was sporadic, supplies were inadequate, and black markets emerged where those with money could buy food at extortionate prices while the poor starved. Families began consuming everything. Furniture was burned for fuel as coal supplies were exhausted. Gardens were stripped of anything remotely edible. Tulip bulbs, normally ornamental, were dug up and boiled despite their toxicity. Sugar beets, typically used as livestock feed, became precious human food. Pets, cats, dogs, even birds, were killed for meat. The first starvation deaths were reported, primarily among the elderly and infirm. Those whose bodies were already weakened by age or illness succumbed first. Mass graves began appearing in Dutch cemeteries as individual burials became logistically impossible. January, March 1945. Full catastrophe. Ration distribution became sporadic, then ceased entirely for weeks at a time. The official ration dropped to 580 calories per day in January, then to 400 calories in February, roughly one-fifth of what humans need to survive. But even these inadequate rations weren't reliably distributed. Many families went days or weeks without any official food supplies. Desperate families boiled tulip bulbs, which caused severe digestive problems and provided minimal nutritional value. The bulbs contained toxic alkaloids that made people sick, but starvation left no choice. Sugar beets, normally never consumed by humans, became the staple food for thousands. The beets were hard, unpalatable, and nutritionally inadequate, but they were something. Deaths accelerated dramatically. Bodies began appearing on streets, people who'd collapsed from weakness and never gotten up. Municipal authorities struggled to collect the dead. Families kept deceased relatives in their homes because they lacked the strength to transport bodies or because they feared losing the extra ration card. Children stopped growing. Schools that remained open reported students too weak to concentrate, fainting during lessons, or sleeping at desks because conserving energy was more important than learning. Teachers with any food would share tiny portions with students who looked closest to death, making impossible choices about which children to help. April 1945. Peak suffering. With spring approaching but no food reserves surviving winter, death rates reached their highest point. Parents watched children waste away, unable to provide even minimal nutrition. The psychological torture of watching your own child die slowly while being powerless to save them broke countless families. Mass graves were dug for starvation victims in cemeteries across Western Netherlands. Rotterdam, Amsterdam, The Hague, Utrecht, every major city reported hundreds of deaths weekly. Entire communities hovered at the edge of collapse. Civil order was maintained mostly through exhaustion. People were too weak to riot or resist. Dutch undertakers worked around the clock burying the dead in mass graves because individual funerals were impossible. The graves were marked with simple wooden crosses bearing only dates, no names. There were too many dead to process individually. Families would visit these mass graves, knowing their loved ones were buried there but not knowing exactly where. The psychological impact of watching children starve was documented in countless testimonies from survivors. Parents described the agony of having nothing to feed hungry children, of watching them grow weaker daily, of making impossible choices about dividing inadequate food among multiple children. The despair was absolute, knowing your children were dying and being powerless to save them. Anna van den Berg, a mother of 3 in Amsterdam, wrote in her diary in March 1945, "Today, my youngest asked for bread. I had none. She cried, then stopped crying because she's too weak to cry for long. She's 7 years old and weighs perhaps 30 pounds. I watch her dying and can do nothing. If the Americans don't come soon, she won't survive. None of them will. I pray to God for food, but God seems as far away as the Americans. My husband died last week. He gave his food to the children until he had nothing left. I told him to eat, but he wouldn't. Now he's gone, and the children are still starving. I don't know how much longer I can endure this." Children bore the heaviest burden of hunger winter because growing bodies required nutrition that simply wasn't available. The physiological effects of severe childhood malnutrition were documented by Dutch doctors who maintained medical records despite impossible conditions. The symptoms followed a predictable progression: initial weight loss as fat stores were consumed, then muscle wasting as the body cannibalized its own tissues for protein, then edema, swelling from protein deficiency as fluid leaked from blood vessels into tissues. Finally came organ system failures that preceded death: kidneys shutting down, hearts weakening, livers failing. Children's bodies were consuming themselves to survive. Their immune systems collapsed, making them vulnerable to diseases that would be minor under normal circumstances. A simple cold could become fatal pneumonia. Minor cuts became infected wounds. Diseases that healthy children would survive killed malnourished ones. Dr. Hendrik Mulder, a pediatrician in Rotterdam who treated starving children throughout the crisis, kept detailed medical records that documented the horror. His notes from March 1945 provide clinical detail that's almost unbearable to read. Patient, female, age 9. Weight 38 pounds, normal 65 pounds, severe muscle wasting, edema in extremities, hair loss, skin lesions from vitamin deficiency, presenting with kwashiorkor, protein-calorie malnutrition, abdomen distended from fluid accumulation despite overall emaciation. Patient can barely walk, cannot climb stairs. Mental function impaired, responds slowly to questions, appears confused. Prognosis: without immediate nutritional intervention, death within 2 to 3 weeks. With food, possibility of recovery if organ damage not too severe, but we have no food to give. Patient, male, age 12. Weight 52 pounds, normal 90 pounds. Marasmus, total calorie deprivation. Body has consumed all fat and muscle. Skin hangs loose on skeletal frame. Patient appears geriatric despite youth. Face deeply lined, movements slow and labored. Vision impaired from vitamin A deficiency. Several teeth lost from scurvy. Patient too weak to stand unassisted. Prognosis: terminal. Even if food becomes available, damage may be irreversible. I can do nothing but document his death. Patient, female, age 6. Weight 28 pounds, normal 45 pounds. Brought in by mother who is herself severely malnourished. Child unresponsive, breathing shallow, heart rate erratic, core temperature low. Patient died 30 minutes after arrival. And this is the 4th child under age 10 who has died in my care today. I have no medicine, no food, nothing to offer families except confirmation that their children are dying. I feel helpless and furious that children are dying of starvation in a civilized nation in the 20th century. Schools that remained nominally open became showcases of horror. Teachers reported children fainting from hunger during lessons. Some children were too weak to walk to school and had to be carried by parents or older siblings. Others fell asleep at desks because conserving energy had become more important than education. One teacher, Johanna de Groot, kept a journal describing conditions in her Amsterdam classroom. January 15, 1945. 23 students present today, down from 42 in September. Some have died. Others are too weak to attend. Those who came sit motionless at their desks, lacking energy even to fidget as children normally do. We attempted arithmetic lessons, but half the class couldn't concentrate long enough to complete simple problems. 2 children fell asleep. I let them sleep. They need rest more than education. February 8, 1945. 15 students today. Willem collapsed during morning lessons. We revived him with water, but he had no food to give him strength. His parents sent him to school with nothing. They have nothing. I gave him half my own ration, a piece of bread the size of my thumb. He cried while eating it. I cried watching him. This is no way for children to live. March 22, 1945. 10 students. The classroom feels empty. Helena didn't return after spring break. Her mother came to tell me Helena died. She was 8 years old. We cried together. There are no lessons today. I can't teach when children are dying. We sit together in silence because none of us have energy for anything else. The psychological effects on children were equally devastating. Chronic hunger consumed their consciousness. They became listless, withdrawn, unable to play or engage in normal childhood activities. The energy required for running, jumping, laughing, normal childhood experiences, simply didn't exist when bodies were starving. Some children became obsessed with food, talking constantly about meals they remembered from before the embargo. They would describe elaborate feasts, imagining foods they hadn't tasted in months. Others stopped talking about food entirely because discussing what they couldn't have was too painful. The psychological division between these two responses often followed family lines. Children whose families still had occasional food scraps maintained hope, while children whose families had nothing descended into silent despair. Children who survived later described the all-consuming nature of hunger. It wasn't like missing a meal or feeling hungry before dinner. It was a constant, gnawing pain that dominated every waking moment and invaded dreams at night. Food became the only thing that mattered, more important than school, more important than play, more important than anything except survival itself. Many children described dreams about food, elaborate fantasies of full meals, fresh bread, meat, vegetables. They would wake crying because the food in their dreams wasn't real. Some children spoke of hallucinating food, seeing meals that didn't exist because their minds were so focused on hunger that perception itself became distorted. Dutch families faced impossible moral dilemmas that no parent should ever confront. With food scarce enough that not everyone could survive, who received what little was available? The question had no good answer, only variations of tragedy. Some families tried to divide food equally, sharing the suffering democratically. If there was one small potato for 6 people, it would be cut into 6 pieces, everyone receiving an equal portion regardless of age or need. This approach maintained fairness but meant everyone starved together at the same rate. Other families made agonizing triage decisions. Parents would prioritize younger children, reasoning that older children had better survival chances. Or they would focus limited resources on the children who seemed stronger, effectively condemning weaker siblings to death in hopes that at least someone would survive. The moral calculus was horrifying but inescapable when resources were so limited that universal survival was impossible. Hendrik van der Meer, a father of 4 in The Hague, described his choices in testimony recorded after the war. My oldest son, Peter, was 14. My youngest daughter, Sophie, was 4. We had food enough for perhaps 3 people, not 6. My wife and I discussed what to do. We decided to give most food to the youngest children, Sophie and her 6-year-old brother. We told Peter and our 11-year-old daughter that they were old enough to survive on less. It was a lie. We were sentencing them to death to save the younger children. Peter understood. He never complained, never asked for more food. He just grew weaker. He died in March, 2 months before liberation. He was 14 years old and he starved to death so his siblings might live. I made that choice. I killed my son to save my daughter. Tell me how a father lives with that. The social fabric of communities began fraying under the pressure of desperation. Theft became common, even among neighbors who'd known each other for generations. Food that was carefully saved would disappear, stolen by someone else who was equally desperate. The bonds of community, usually strengthened by shared hardship, were weakened by competition for scarce resources. Black markets flourished, but prices were so inflated that only the wealthy could afford even minimal food. A single loaf of bread might cost the equivalent of a month's pre-war salary. A pound of butter could require trading family heirlooms, jewelry, or anything of value. The class distinctions that had always existed became literal life-and-death divisions. The wealthy could sometimes buy survival while the poor starved. Some Dutch civilians collaborated with German authorities in exchange for food. The moral calculus was simple and terrible. Betray your neighbors to feed your children or maintain honor while they starve. History would judge the collaborators harshly, but in the moment, with skeletal children crying from hunger, the choice wasn't always clear. Was preserving moral purity worth watching your children die? Many collaborators were ostracized after liberation, their wartime choices becoming permanent stains on their reputations. But some survivors spoke with grudging understanding about those who'd collaborated. Father Hendrikus van Asten, a Catholic priest who'd worked with starving families, later said, "I cannot judge those who betrayed others for food. I didn't have children. I didn't watch my own sons and daughters dying of hunger. Perhaps I would have made the same choice. God judges us by the weight of our burdens, not by abstract standards of honor." The elderly often made the choice to sacrifice themselves. Grandparents would claim they weren't hungry, would insist the children eat their portions, would slowly starve while watching younger generations receive what little food existed. The choice was framed as natural. Old people had lived their lives, but children deserved their chance. Dutch cemeteries from that winter contain countless graves of elderly who effectively chose death so children might live. Sometimes the choice was explicit, grandparents announcing they would take smaller portions. Other times it was silent, elderly family members simply eating less and less without explanation until they weakened and died. The sacrifice was honored but heartbreaking. Families grieved even as they understood the logic that had killed their parents and grandparents. Allied forces advancing through Europe in early 1945 faced strategic priorities that delayed liberation of Western Netherlands. The region wasn't directly on the path to Germany's heartland. German forces there weren't posing a significant military threat to Allied advance. Diverting resources to liberate Western Netherlands would slow the final push into Germany proper and potentially prolong the war. But Allied commanders were aware of the humanitarian crisis developing behind German lines. Intelligence reports from Dutch resistance, communications intercepted from German authorities discussing the food embargo, and information from Dutch refugees who'd escaped to Allied-held territory all described catastrophic starvation conditions. The strategic calculus became deeply uncomfortable for Allied leadership. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces, received regular briefings about Dutch civilian deaths. The numbers grew weekly: 200 dead this week, 300 next week, 500 the week after. The deaths were accelerating as spring approached without food reserves to sustain starving populations. Eisenhower and British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery both advocated for humanitarian action, but they faced constraints. Military operations required resources. Every ton of food dropped to Dutch civilians was a ton not available for combat operations. Every aircraft diverted to humanitarian missions was an aircraft not supporting ground forces. The compromise solution was Operation Manna, British, and Operation Chowhound, American, massive airdrops of food, supplies to starving Dutch civilians in German-occupied territory. The operations required negotiating with German commanders to ensure they wouldn't fire on Allied aircraft flying humanitarian missions. The negotiations were complex and ethically fraught. Allied commanders were negotiating with the same German authorities who'd imposed the starvation embargo. German commanders, recognizing that the war was lost and perhaps seeking to improve their positions for post-war judgment, agreed not to fire on Allied aircraft dropping food supplies. Operation Manna began on April 29, 1945, with British Lancaster and Halifax bombers, the same aircraft that had carried bombs to German cities, now carrying food to Dutch civilians. The bombers flew at low altitude, between 300 and 500 feet, dropping sacks of food over designated zones in cities across Western Netherlands. Operation Chowhound began on May 1, 1945, with American B-17 flying fortresses joining the food drops. The same aircraft that had bombed German industry now delivered salvation to starving civilians. The sight of Allied bombers appearing at low altitude, not dropping bombs but dropping food, created scenes of desperate hope and overwhelming emotion. Dutch civilians who'd spent years diving into shelters at the sound of aircraft engines now rushed toward the sound, gathering at designated drop zones to collect the falling supplies. Captain Robert Thompson, a B-17 pilot from California, described his first food drop mission over Rotterdam. "We came in low, 300 feet, maybe less. So low we could see people's faces clearly. They were waving, cheering, jumping up and down despite looking like skeletons. We dropped our load, sacks of flour, canned meat, chocolate, powdered milk, and watched it rain down over the city. People were running toward the drop zone even before the supplies landed. I'd flown 30 bombing missions over Germany. This was Mission 31, but it felt completely different. For the first time, I was saving lives instead of taking them. My bombardier was crying. So was I. We were all crying, because it felt like the war finally made sense. We were feeding starving children instead of killing. People The airdrops provided crucial psychological relief beyond the physical food. For Dutch civilians who'd felt abandoned, who'd wondered if anyone in the outside world knew or cared about their suffering, the sight of Allied bombers delivering food proved that someone was trying to help. The isolation ended. Hope returned, but the airdrops couldn't solve the crisis completely. The supplies reached only a fraction of the affected population, perhaps 500,000 people out of 4.5 million. Distribution was chaotic. Drop zones were designated, but not everyone could reach them. People too weak to walk couldn't collect supplies. The food dropped in a single mission might sustain a neighborhood for days. But cities needed sustained delivery for weeks, and most critically, children who were already dying of severe malnutrition needed immediate, sustained medical nutrition that occasional airdrops couldn't provide. A sack of flour didn't help a child whose digestive system had shut down from months of starvation. Powdered milk was useless to a child too weak to prepare it. The operation saved thousands of lives and prevented deaths that would have occurred without the food deliveries. But they weren't solutions. They were stopgap measures that bought time until ground liberation could deliver systematic relief. Full liberation and organized food distribution remained necessary to truly end the crisis when Allied ground forces finally liberated Western Netherlands in early May 1945. Simultaneously with German surrender, they discovered a humanitarian crisis that exceeded anything intelligence reports had fully conveyed. The statistics had documented deaths and malnutrition rates. They hadn't captured the visceral reality of entire communities. On the edge of collapse, American and Canadian forces advancing into Western Netherlands encountered populations that were simultaneously desperate for liberation and too weak to properly celebrate it. The traditional scenes of joyous liberation, dancing in streets, cheering crowds, flowers thrown at soldiers, were replaced by more subdued but profoundly emotional responses from people who'd been starved for months. The contrast with earlier liberations was stark. When Paris was liberated in August 1944, crowds had poured into streets, music played, wine flowed. When Brussels was freed, celebrations lasted days. But in Dutch cities in May 1945, the celebrations were quiet, slow, weighted by months of suffering that liberation couldn't immediately erase. Captain Thomas Morrison, whose company was among the first American units into Wageningen, described the scene in his after-action report. "We expected celebrations like we'd seen in France and Belgium. We got something more moving and more heartbreaking. People came out of their homes slowly, carefully, like they weren't sure they had energy to spare on celebration. Many were crying. Not happy tears, but tears of relief mixed with grief for those who hadn't survived to see this day. When they saw we had food, that we were distributing it immediately, many just broke down completely. Grown men weeping, women collapsing to their knees in gratitude, children staring at chocolate bars like they'd forgotten such things existed. It was the most emotional liberation I'd experienced in the entire war. The immediate priority became feeding starving populations as quickly as possible. Combat units that had been focused on military objectives suddenly found themselves running humanitarian operations on a massive scale. Every available food supply was broken out and distributed. Field kitchens prepared meals continuously. Medical personnel triaged the most severely malnourished for urgent treatment. The scale of need was overwhelming. In Wageningen alone, over 4,000 civilians required immediate food assistance. Multiply that across dozens of liberated towns and cities. Rotterdam, Amsterdam, The Hague, Utrecht, Haarlem, and the logistics of feeding 4.5 million starving people became clear. Army supply officers scrambled to redirect resources. Warehouses were emptied. Transport trucks that normally carried ammunition now carried food. The entire logistics operation pivoted from supporting combat to supporting humanitarian relief. The shift happened without official orders. Unit commanders simply made decisions based on what they saw and what needed to be done. Lieutenant Colonel James Bradley, a logistics officer with 1st Canadian Army, later described the operational challenge. "We were prepared for combat logistics, moving ammunition, fuel, parts, We weren't prepared for feeding millions of starving civilians. Our supply system was designed to support military operations, not humanitarian relief. But when you see children who weigh less than half what they should, when you watch parents collapsing from relief when you give them food, you figure it out fast. We requisitioned everything, every scrap of food from every warehouse. We stripped our own field kitchens. Soldiers gave up their personal rations. Cooks worked 18-hour shifts preparing meals. Medics established nutrition clinics in every liberated town. It was chaos, but purposeful chaos. We saved lives through sheer willpower and resource mobilization. American soldiers who participated in feeding operations in the Netherlands experienced the work as among the most meaningful of their entire military service. They'd fought across Europe, won battles, defeated German forces, but feeding Dutch children who were starving to death felt more significant than any combat victory. The soldiers' response went beyond following orders or completing assigned missions. They gave away personal supplies, shared their own rations, spent off-duty time playing with Dutch children and helping families. The humanitarian work became a personal investment in helping people they'd come to care about. Private First Class Eugene Henderson from Massachusetts wrote to his family in May 1945, "We're feeding Dutch families who haven't had real food in months. The children cry when you give them chocolate, not because they're sad, but because they're so grateful they can't contain the emotion. Yesterday, a little girl about 6 years old gave me a flower she'd picked. It was the only thing she had to give, and she wanted me to have it because I'd given her food. I cried. I'm not ashamed to admit it. This is why we fought the war, so children like her could have flowers instead of starvation. All the battles, all the friends I lost, all the terrible things I saw, they all matter because we saved these kids." The cultural connections formed between American soldiers and Dutch civilians were immediate and deep. The Netherlands was a Western European nation with cultural similarities to America, democratic traditions, and populations that spoke some English. Many Dutch civilians had learned English in school. The communication barrier was much lower than in other liberated territories. Dutch families opened their homes to American soldiers, sharing what little they had recovered. Americans responded with food, supplies, and friendship. Children followed American soldiers everywhere, practicing English, asking about America, showing them around recovered towns. The relationships transcended military occupation to become genuine cross-cultural friendships. Sergeant Robert Mitchell from Ohio befriended the Vanderberg family in Amsterdam, a mother and 3 children who'd survived hunger winter but lost their father to starvation in March. Mitchell visited daily, bringing food, helping repair their damaged home, playing with the children. He wrote in his journal, "The Vanderberg kids, Jan, Marie, and Sophie, have adopted me as temporary father figure. Their actual father died from starvation giving his food to his family. Mrs. Vanderberg shows me his photo every time I visit, as if she wants me to know who I'm replacing temporarily. I tell her I could never replace him, that he was a hero for what he did. She cries every time I say it. Today, Sophie, the youngest at age 5, asked if I would stay in Netherlands after the war. I told her I have to go home to Ohio, but I'd never forget them. She said, 'You saved my life. I will never forget you either.' I'm not sure I saved her life. The army supplied the food, but I understand what she means. These kids have nothing. Giving them food and attention feels more important than anything else I've done in this war." Many American soldiers formed bonds with specific Dutch families that lasted long after the war ended. They corresponded for decades, sent care packages during post-war recovery, even traveled back to the Netherlands years later to visit the families they'd helped save. Corporal James Bradley maintained correspondence with the De Vries family for over 40 years after the war. The letters, preserved in the Netherlands Institute for War Documentation, show a progression from formal gratitude to genuine friendship to family-like bonds that spanned generations. Bradley attended the weddings of children he'd helped feed in 1945. He sent money to help them attend university. When he died in 1989, Dutch family members he'd saved 44 years earlier traveled to his funeral in Ohio. The physical recovery of Dutch children from severe malnutrition required months of careful nutrition and medical care. Bodies that had been systematically starved couldn't simply resume normal function when food became available. The rehabilitation process was gradual, supervised, and often complicated by medical issues resulting from prolonged deprivation. American and Allied medical personnel established specialized clinics for treating childhood malnutrition. The facilities provided supervised feeding, vitamin supplementation, treatment for diseases that had flourished during starvation periods, and monitoring for complications. The medical challenge was more complex than simply providing food. Children who'd been severely malnourished for months couldn't tolerate normal meals immediately. Their digestive systems had atrophied. Their bodies had adapted to starvation by reducing metabolic function to conserve energy. Reintroducing food too quickly could cause refeeding syndrome, a potentially fatal condition, where rapid nutritional restoration triggered dangerous metabolic shifts. Refeeding syndrome was poorly understood in 1945, but military doctors working with Dutch physicians quickly recognized the pattern. Children who were fed normal meals immediately after liberation sometimes worsened rather than improved. Their hearts would develop abnormal rhythms. They'd retain water dangerously. Some died despite finally having access to food because their bodies couldn't handle the transition from starvation to adequate nutrition. Army doctors worked with Dutch physicians to develop feeding protocols that gradually increased caloric intake while monitoring for complications. The protocols were improvised, based on observed results rather than formal medical research, but they worked. Children received small, frequent meals initially, perhaps 6 to 8 tiny portions per day instead of 3 normal-sized meals. The portions increased slowly, by 100 or 200 calories every few days as their bodies readjusted to adequate nutrition. The progression could take weeks or even months before children could tolerate normal meals. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, an Army nurse assigned to a children's nutrition clinic in Amsterdam, described the process in Letters Home. "We're learning to feed starving children through trial and error. Some of what we try works, some doesn't. We lost 3 children last week because we fed them too much too fast. Their bodies couldn't handle the sudden nutrition. Now we're being more careful, starting with tiny amounts and increasing gradually. It's heartbreaking to have food available but having to withhold it because giving too much will kill them. The children don't understand. They're hungry and we have food, but we can't give them full meals. They cry and beg, and I have to tell them, not yet, while explaining that we're trying to save their lives. It's the hardest medical work I've ever done. The psychological recovery was equally important and equally complex. Children who'd spent months or years living with chronic hunger, watching people die of starvation, and experiencing the terror of not knowing if they'd survive needed more than just food. They needed safety, stability, and time to process trauma. Allied personnel organized schools, recreation programs, and activities designed to help Dutch children begin recovering normal childhood experiences. American soldiers played baseball with Dutch kids, taught them American songs, organized games and events. The activities were more than entertainment. They were psychological rehabilitation through normal childhood experiences. The transformation was gradual but profound. Children who'd been listless and withdrawn began playing again. Those who'd stopped smiling discovered they could laugh. Kids who'd been too weak to run gradually regained strength and energy. The physical healing enabled psychological healing, and vice versa. But some children never fully recovered psychologically. Those who'd watched siblings or parents die of starvation, who'd experienced the most severe trauma, carried scars that lasted lifetimes. Some developed what we'd now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, though that diagnosis didn't exist in 1945. They had nightmares about starvation, anxiety about food scarcity, difficulty trusting that tomorrow's meal would actually appear. Dutch psychologists worked with these children throughout the late 1940s and 1950s, developing therapeutic approaches that would later inform trauma treatment for survivors of other catastrophes. the Hunger Winter Children became case studies in understanding how childhood trauma affects development and how therapeutic intervention can help recovery. Individual stories reveal the human reality behind statistics. Marieke de Vries was 9 years old when American forces liberated Utrecht in May 1945. She weighed 38 pounds, approximately what a healthy 4-year-old should weigh. Her brother, Peter, age 7, had died of starvation 3 weeks before liberation. Her mother had survived by foraging for tulip bulbs and sharing her own meager rations with Marieke, slowly starving herself so her daughter might live. Marieke later described the moment of liberation in testimony recorded in the 1980s. "I remember seeing American soldiers coming down our street. My mother carried me outside because I couldn't walk anymore. I don't remember being excited or happy. I was too weak for strong emotions. I remember thinking they looked impossibly large and healthy, like they were a different species than us. We'd become so thin, so skeletal, and these soldiers looked like giants." An American corporal stopped in front of us. He looked at me. I remember his face changing as he realized how thin I was. He said something in English I didn't understand, then reached into his pack and pulled out a chocolate bar and a small can of condensed milk. He handed them to my mother, who just started crying. She couldn't speak. She just held the food and cried. I took the chocolate bar and ate it immediately. I'd forgotten what chocolate tasted like. It was the most amazing thing I'd ever experienced. The corporal knelt down and spoke to me slowly in English. I didn't understand the words, but I understood the kindness in his voice. He was telling me I'd be okay, that we had food now, that we were safe. I believed him. The corporal was James Bradley from Ohio, a 24-year-old soldier who'd fought across Europe and was days away from going home. Bradley visited the de Vries family daily for the next 3 weeks, bringing food, checking on Marike's recovery, playing simple games with her as she regained strength. He wrote to his wife describing Marike as, "The reason I'm glad we won this war, so little girls like her can grow up healthy instead of starving." By June 1945, Marieke had gained 12 pounds and could walk without assistance. By August, she'd gained another 15 pounds and was playing with other children. By October, when Bradley's unit shipped home, she was a healthy weight for her age, attending school regularly and beginning to laugh again. The transformation from skeletal ghost to healthy child took 5 months of supervised nutrition, medical care, and psychological support. But the recovery was incomplete in ways that weren't immediately visible. Marieke would later develop health problems in adulthood, cardiovascular issues, metabolic problems that research linked to her childhood starvation. The hunger winter had permanently affected her physiology in ways that modern medicine could manage but not erase. Bradley and the de Vries family maintained correspondence for over 40 years. Marieke learned English partly through his letters. She visited the United States in 1962, meeting Bradley's family in Ohio. They maintained contact through letters, phone calls, and occasional visits. When Bradley died in 1989, Marieke traveled to his funeral, giving a eulogy describing him as the American soldier who gave me chocolate and gave me my life back. Marieke lived until 2019, dying at age 83. She had 3 children, 7 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren. She attended university, worked as a teacher, traveled extensively, and lived a full, healthy life. But she never forgot the chocolate bar, the corporal from Ohio, or the moment when American soldiers saved her life. Medical research conducted decades after the hunger winter revealed that severe childhood malnutrition had long-lasting effects, even on children who fully recovered physically. Dutch researchers began tracking hunger winter survivors in the 1960s, creating what became one of the most comprehensive longitudinal studies of famine effects ever conducted. The research discovered increased rates of certain health conditions in adulthood among those who'd been children during the famine. Hunger. Winter survivors showed higher incidence of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and obesity in middle age. Counterintuitive findings, since one might expect starvation to protect against obesity. But the research revealed that severe childhood malnutrition apparently programmed metabolisms for survival in food-scarce environments. When food became abundant in post-war prosperity, those adapted metabolisms stored energy aggressively, creating health problems. Women who'd been children during hunger winter gave birth to babies with slightly lower birth weights on average, suggesting epigenetic changes that transmitted starvation's effects across generations. The research revealed that severe childhood malnutrition affected not just individuals but potentially their descendants. These findings revolutionized understanding of how early life nutrition affects lifelong health. The hunger winter cohort became one of the most studied populations in medical history, contributing to knowledge about famine effects, metabolic programming, and transgenerational health impacts. But the research also documented remarkable resilience. Most hunger winter survivors lived normal, healthy lives. They attended university, pursued careers, raised families. The early trauma didn't prevent them from thriving. It simply left subtle marks that medical science could detect but that didn't define their lives. The psychological impacts were more variable. Some survivors developed what we'd now recognize as post-traumatic stress, anxiety about food scarcity, hoarding behaviors, difficulty throwing away leftovers. Dutch psychologists documented these patterns through case studies and therapeutic interventions that helped many survivors process their trauma. Other survivors seemed psychologically unscathed, remembering the hunger winter as terrible but not allowing it to dominate their adult lives. They integrated the experience as part of their history without being controlled by it. Many survivors credited the American soldiers who'd fed them as children with not just saving their lives, but demonstrating that kindness existed even in war's worst circumstances. That lesson, that strangers could be compassionate, that powerful nations could use their strength for good, shaped their worldviews profoundly. The relationships formed between American soldiers and Dutch civilians during liberation created connections that lasted generations and shaped post-war Dutch-American relations in ways that exceeded normal diplomatic relationships. Hundreds of American veterans returned to the Netherlands after the war, visiting the families they'd helped save. The visits weren't official military business. They were personal pilgrimages back to places and people that had given their military service meaning. Veterans saved money, arranged time off work, and traveled back to the Netherlands to see Dutch families they'd met during liberation. Some marriages resulted from these connections. American soldiers who'd formed relationships with Dutch women during liberation returned after demobilization to propose. The resulting marriages created direct family bonds between the two nations. Children who were half American, half Dutch, growing up with connections to both cultures. Others maintained decades-long correspondence with Dutch families, exchanging Christmas cards, photographs, and eventually email once technology enabled it. The relationships evolved from formal gratitude to genuine friendship to family-like bonds that included multiple generations. Dutch families who'd been saved by American soldiers often named children after their liberators. Boys born in 1946 and 1947 carried American names: James, William, Robert, Eugene, honoring the soldiers who'd fed their older siblings. The names became living memorials to wartime compassion, carried forward through generations. The gratitude wasn't performative or temporary. It was deep, genuine, and lasting. Dutch families remembered specific soldiers who'd helped them, told stories about them to their children and grandchildren, and maintained those memories with reverence typically reserved for family. The American Battle Monuments Commission maintains a cemetery at Margraten in the Netherlands where 8,301 American soldiers are buried, men who died in the liberation campaigns of 1944 to 45. Since shortly after the war's end, Dutch families have adopted every single grave, caring for them continuously. The adoption program means that every American buried at Margraten has a Dutch family that considers caring for that grave a sacred duty. Families place flowers regularly, maintain the grounds around their adopted grave, and research the soldier's life to honor their memory personally. Some families have maintained the same grave for 3 generations, passing the responsibility from grandparents who experienced liberation to parents who grew up with stories of starvation and American help to children who carry forward the tradition despite having no direct memory of the war. It's a form of gratitude that transcends normal diplomatic relationships. The Dutch aren't maintaining these graves because governments require it or because it's politically useful. They're doing it because they remember, because saving their children mattered, because they believe debts of gratitude should be honored across generations. Every year on May 5th, Liberation Day, the Netherlands celebrates freedom with festivals, concerts, and public events across the country. But alongside the celebrations are solemn commemorations of those who died during occupation, particularly during Hunger Winter. American veterans and their families are honored guests at Liberation Day events. When veterans attend, now very elderly, in wheelchairs or with oxygen support, they receive standing ovations that last minutes. Dutch crowds, many too young to remember the war personally, applaud men who helped save their grandparents and great-grandparents. The veterans often weep at these receptions, overwhelmed by gratitude that lasted 80 years, surprised that what they did in their early 20s continues mattering to people they've never met. The recognition validates their service in ways that military medals never could. Dutch schoolchildren learn about the Starvation Winter and American liberation as core components of their education. The history isn't sanitized or simplified. Students learn both the horror of German-imposed starvation and the compassion of American liberation. They learn specific stories, read diaries from Hunger Winter, visit museums and memorial sites. The National Liberation Museum in Groesbeek contains extensive exhibits specifically about Hunger Winter and American food relief operations. Visitors can see de-rationed chocolate bars like the ones American soldiers distributed, photographs of skeletal children receiving food, and video testimonies from both Dutch survivors and American liberators. One exhibit features a wall of photographs, before and after images of Dutch children. The before photos from April 1945 show skeletal children with hollow eyes, protruding bones, and expressions of despair. The after photos from December 1945 show the same children transformed, healthy, smiling, unrecognizable as the same individuals. The visual evidence of recovery is more powerful than any statistics. Another exhibit allows visitors to listen to recorded interviews with Hunger Winter survivors describing what starvation felt like, what it meant to watch their siblings dying, and what they felt when American soldiers arrived with food. The testimonies are unflinching about suffering and equally clear about gratitude. I was 9 years old and weighed 35 pounds. I couldn't walk anymore. I was dying, and I knew it. When American soldiers gave me food, I thought I was dreaming. I thought angels had come. In a way, they were angels. They saved my life. I'm 87 now. I've had a long, good life. I have children and grandchildren. None of them would exist if Americans hadn't fed me in 1945. How do you thank someone for your entire family's existence? Return to that opening scene. Staff Sergeant William Cooper kneeling before a skeletal 7-year-old girl in wooden clogs, extending a de-rationed chocolate bar that represented more than simple food. That chocolate bar was mercy made tangible. It was hope made physical. It was proof that strangers could be kind, that powerful nations could choose compassion, that even in war's darkest moments, humanity could triumph over cruelty. When the girl clutched that chocolate bar to her chest and whispered, "Thank you," through tears, she was expressing more than gratitude for food. She was experiencing the return of hope after months of watching hope die. She was learning that the world contained kindness as well as cruelty. She was discovering that she would live instead of die, Cooper would later say that giving away that chocolate bar was the most important thing he did in the entire war. Not the firefights, not the tactical victories, not the medals earned. The moment when he fed a starving child felt more significant than anything else. He was right. The military victories in World War II were necessary and just. But what made those victories meaningful, what justified the terrible cost in blood and treasure, was what happened after military operations ended. Did the victorious nations use their power to help or to dominate? Did they feed the hungry or exploit the defeated? Did they rebuild or extract? In the Netherlands, America chose to help, to feed the hungry, to rebuild, to demonstrate that democratic societies valued human life enough to mobilize massive resources for humanitarian purposes, even amid war's chaos. The children who survived Hunger Winter because American soldiers fed them became living evidence that these choices mattered. They raised families in freedom and prosperity. They built successful lives. They taught their children and grandchildren about the Americans who'd saved them. And when those children, now elderly, tell their stories, they speak of chocolate bars and canned rations, of wooden clogs and skeletal bodies, of tears and gratitude and hope returning when all hope seemed lost. They speak of the moment when American soldiers saved their lives, not through military force but through simple human kindness. One chocolate bar, one can of rations, one act of compassion at a time. That moment, repeated thousands of times across dozens of Dutch towns in May 1945, represented victory more profound than any battlefield triumph. It was the victory of civilization over barbarism, of compassion over cruelty, of hope over despair. It was the victory of choosing to feed hungry children when no strategic advantage required it, when regulations might have prevented it, when logistics made it difficult and military priorities suggested other uses for resources. It was Americans deciding that saving Dutch children mattered more than anything else, and in that decision, proving that democratic societies could be both powerful and good, both militarily effective and deeply humane. The skeletal children in wooden clogs who cried when strangers gave them chocolate lived. They grew up healthy. They raised children who lived in freedom. They became living monuments to the power of compassion in war's darkest hours. And 80 years later, their children and grandchildren still remember the Americans who saved them, still tend the graves at Margraten, still teach new generations about the bond created when one nation chose to save another nation's dying children. That bond, forged by chocolate bars and condensed milk, by soldiers who gave away their rations, by a nation that used its power for humanitarian purposes, remains as strong today as in May 1945. Because some gifts can never be repaid, only honored, and some debts of gratitude last forever. The Dutch remember, and in remembering, they keep alive the truth that even in war's worst moments, humans can choose compassion over cruelty, mercy over indifference, and hope over despair. One chocolate bar at a time.